A little-known but very interesting biblical character is Ebed-Melech. Who was Ebed-Melech? Ebed-Melech was an Ethiopian, a servant in the household of King Zedekiah of Judah, mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. He appears in Jeremiah 38, when the prophet Jeremiah is thrown into a muddy pit to die. Ebed-Melech, with courage and compassion, intercedes with the king and obtains permission to rescue Jeremiah, saving his life. Why is he special? Despite being a foreigner and a servant, Ebed-Melech demonstrated more justice, courage, and faith than many Israelites of the time. Because of his attitude, God promises to protect him during the destruction of Jerusalem. Jeremiah 39:15-18. Would you like me to develop a more in-depth text about him, perhaps in the form of a script or engaging narrative? The roots of courage. The blazing Ethiopian sun rose over the fertile plains of a small village near the Blue Nile River. Against this backdrop of distant mountains and golden fields of sorghum, a dark-skinned boy with intensely curious eyes was born. Ebed, a name that in his native tongue meant servant of the Most High. His father, Kepha, was a wise and respected man in the village, a storyteller and scholar of ancient scrolls brought from distant lands. His mother, Zewditu, was a healer and a woman of prayer, someone who saw the invisible hand of God in everything. Ebed was different from an early age. While other children ran along the trails, he would sit at his father's feet and listen to stories of righteous kings, bold prophets, and the invisible God who ruled heaven and earth. His heart beat for something greater than the confines of his village. There was a sacred restlessness about him, a thirst for purpose. At the age of 7, he first heard about Jerusalem. His father spoke of it as a jewel among the nations, the city where the God of Israel had chosen to dwell his name. For Ebed, these stories lit a fire in his heart. Night after night, he dreamed of cobblestone streets, grand temples, and a chosen people. But his childhood days were not without trials. The drought that struck his village when he was 9 devastated the crops. Famine stalked homes, and many left, never to return. Ebed learned early on that life was fragile and that faith, to be true, had to withstand despair. Even in the midst of suffering, Zewditu never stopped praying with his son. God sees us, Ebed. He has plans for you greater than our eyes can see. Adolescence came with new responsibilities. At the age of 13, he began accompanying his father on trips to the city of Aksum, where they sold handicrafts and traded goods with Hebrew and Egyptian merchants. It was there that he had his first contact with a fugitive Jewish priest, an old man who had escaped persecution in Jerusalem, and who spoke reverently of a prophet named Isaiah, and of a sacred temple built by Solomon. Ebed listened, absorbed, and kept it. In his heart, that foreign faith began to take shape, not as a denial of his origins, but as the next step in a greater spiritual journey. At the age of 15, however, everything changed. A group of Phoenician traders arrived in his village, and among them, slave smugglers. An ambush at dusk separated Ebed from his parents. He saw his mother being taken one way, his father another, while he was tied up and thrown into a straw-covered cart. He screamed, cried, resisted, but it was in vain. For weeks he traveled with other captives to the north. He slept in fear, ate scraps, and prayed in silence. One night in the desert, he dreamed of a solitary tree surrounded by flames. In the midst of it, a voice spoke, "Fear not, for I am with you. Even if they take you far away, I will be with you, and I will use you, my servant, in due time." He woke with tears in his eyes. That was not just a dream. It was a calling. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he was sold into the royal palace as a foreign servant. And there, with the Hebrew name Ebed-Melech, servant of the king, his new life would begin. But he never forgot whom he truly served. The shadow of the walls of Jerusalem. The arrival in Jerusalem was marked by a shock of the senses. The smell of spices and smoke from sacrifices hung in the air. The immense walls seemed to touch the sky, and the incessant movement of soldiers, priests, and merchants made the city beat like a restless heart. For EBED-MELECH, still a 15-year-old boy, all of this was dazzling and oppressive at the same time. He was taken to the palace of King Zedekiah, where foreigners were used for menial tasks. His body was washed, his clothes exchanged for simple tunics, and his African name forgotten by his new masters. Now he was just EBED-MELECH, servant of the king. But deep down, he still remembered the words from his dream in the desert. "My servant, in due time." Life in the palace was full of rules. Servants could not speak without being called, could not eat before the officers, and could never question orders. But Ebed learned quickly. He observed more than he spoke. He knew where to step, who to avoid, and how to listen to conversations without seeming nosy. Soon he was known as efficient, quiet, and trustworthy. But there was something about him that made some officers uncomfortable. His eyes. Ebed's eyes were not submissive. They were attentive, steady, and full of a faith that others did not understand. During the following years, he was assigned to serve in the archives wing of the palace. There, he copied documents, carried parchments, and cleaned shelves. But instead of getting bored, he immersed himself in ancient texts. He learned to read Hebrew, even if secretly. He read the Psalms, the Proverbs, and the writings of the ancient prophets. When the guards were not around, he would recite to himself the verses that touched him most deeply. It was in this environment that he began to hear about the prophet Jeremiah. He was spoken of as a disturber of the peace, a man who insisted on preaching doom, who said the king should surrender to Babylon. Some called him a traitor, others a madman. But to Ebed, there was something different about this figure. Jeremiah spoke with the boldness of one who feared only God. At 25, EBED-MELECH was no longer a boy. His body was firm, his mind sharp, and his silent faith grew like roots in deep soil. Although a slave, he felt freer than many men who wore gold rings and linen tunics. But Jerusalem was in crisis. The threats from Babylon intensified, and fear ran rampant through the palace corridors. The princes pressed King Zedekiah for answers. False prophets promised victory. And Jeremiah, like a rock in the middle of the river, kept saying, "Surrender or perish." Ebed saw him for the first time in one of the temple courtyards. Jeremiah spoke with intensity, surrounded by a crowd divided between fury and curiosity. Some shouted for him to be arrested. Others just listened in silence. Ebed stood at a distance, but he felt as if the prophet was speaking directly to his heart. That same voice he had heard in his dream years ago seemed to echo now, alive, there before him. It was also at this time that he began to understand the true role that was being prepared for him. Jerusalem was not just a destination, it was a mission. The following years brought more tension. The Babylonian siege was approaching. Famine was knocking at the gates. The king's men met in secret, seeking alliances, creating plans that defied God's will. EBED-MELECH observed everything, and even though he could not interfere, he prayed every day. "Lord, show me when to act. Do not let me fear men more than you." It was then that the unexpected happened. Jeremiah was arrested, accused of treason. Accused of undermining the soldiers' morale, EBED-MELECH heard the news with a heavy heart. He knew that the prophet spoke in the name of the Lord. And he also knew that if they abandoned him now, justice would be silenced. Jeremiah's arrest was not the end. The princes wanted more. They wanted his death. And when no one stopped them, they threw the prophet into a deep cistern, where there was no water, only mud. Jeremiah sank up to his knees in the darkness, alone, with no food and no hope of getting out alive. And it was there, at that moment, that the call finally echoed with full force in EBED-MELECH's heart. He was not just a servant. He was a chosen one. The servant who defies kings. The rumor spread quickly through the palace corridors. Jeremiah had been thrown into a waterless cistern, left to die. few cared. To King Zedekiah's princes and officials, this prophet was a nuisance to be disposed of quietly. No one would dare oppose the decision of the powerful. No one, that is, except EBED-MELECH. That night, Ebed slept little. He paced restlessly through the dark corridors of the palace, silently muttering prayers. He felt a weight on his chest, as if every beat of his heart screamed, "Go to the king. Speak. Now is the time." And though logic screamed madness, a foreign slave standing up to the leaders of Judah, his faith was greater than his fear. The next morning, his face set and his eyes aflame with divine conviction, Ebed approached Zedekiah's throne. The guards tried to stop him, but he did not back down. "My lord king," he said in a firm voice, "I have been bold in coming here, but the blood of a righteous man is about to be shed. The prophet Jeremiah has been thrown into a cistern, without bread or water. If he remains there, he will die unjustly." Zedekiah, surprised by the boldness of that foreign servant, remained silent. He knew Jeremiah. Deep down, he feared his words, although he did not have the courage to defend him publicly. But something in Ebed-Melech's voice, something in his eyes, which seemed to consume fear itself, touched him. "Do whatever is necessary to save him," the king replied, looking away as if he were running away from his own conscience. Ebed-Melech wasted no time. He ran through the courtyards, gathered 30 men and provided ropes and rags. He ordered them to tie the rags to the ropes, so as not to hurt the prophet when they pulled him. He thought of everything, even the most humble detail, for he knew that God reveals himself even in silent compassion. At the mouth of the cistern, the soldiers hesitated. Some scoffed, others questioned, "Why save a madman who preaches only destruction?" But Ebed-Melech looked at them with authority, the authority of someone who knows he is doing God's will. "Pull carefully," he shouted, as Jeremiah's dirty, frail body emerged from the darkness. The prophet was shaking, covered in mud, but his eyes lit up when he saw the man. He knew that face. He remembered seeing him in the temple courtyards, listening in silence. Jeremiah knew this was no ordinary servant. That afternoon, back in the courtyard of the guard, Jeremiah looked at Ebed-Melech and said in a weak but grateful voice, "The Lord will not forget you. He has seen your courage, and he will deliver you in the day of trouble." Those words marked Ebed forever. Even after the rescue, the tension in the city continued. Babylon was approaching. The false prophet still said there would be peace. Ebed-Melech, now 30 years old, remained alert. He knew the worst was yet to come. But he was not intimidated. He was a foreigner, a slave, despised by many. And yet he had dared to raise his voice to save a prophet of God. He had discovered who he was. And more, he had discovered the value of obeying a calling greater than life itself. The fall of Jerusalem. The sky over Jerusalem had changed. Gray, oppressive, heavy as the city's own guilt. It was the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, and the Babylonians were at the gates. There was no longer talk of trade, feasts, or sacrifices. Hunger was the new language of the streets. Children cried for scraps. Nobles fled like rats in despair. And the city of God, once proud and imposing, staggered like a drunkard at the end of his journey. Ebed-Melech watched everything in silence. At 35, he was no longer the naive servant who had arrived from the desert. His face bore the marks of constant vigilance, and in his eyes the faith of a man who had seen God deliver a prophet from death. He knew that what was coming was judgment, not injustice. Jeremiah had warned. He had warned with pain, with tears, with the risk of his life. Ebed still served in the palace, now in ruins inside. King Zedekiah, surrounded by fearful advisors and desperate officers, locked himself in endless meetings, refusing to surrender. Each day of resistance was another sentence for the people. One night, Ebed heard muffled voices near the king's chamber. The princes were debating whether to escape through a secret tunnel that led to the Jordan. They feared being captured alive. Ebed, hiding in the shadow of a pillar, understood what was coming: betrayal, abandonment, ruin. The next morning, the city gates were breached. The armies of Babylon poured in like a black tide. The walls fell, soldiers raided homes. The temple was plundered. Men were killed. Women dragged away. Children carried away. The cry of Jerusalem echoed to heaven, and heaven remained silent. EBED-MELECH rushed to the place where Jeremiah was being held prisoner. Thanks to God's protection, the prophet was in the custody of the royal guard, spared from slaughter. When the Babylonian officials arrived, a commander named Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's general, ordered Jeremiah released on the express orders of the king of Babylon. It was at this point that Jeremiah took EBED-MELECH aside. His words were like honey in a time of bitterness. "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says: I will deliver you, EBED-MELECH. In the day of punishment, when all fall by the sword, you will not be handed over to those you fear, because you trusted in me." There among the ruins and the prisoners, EBED-MELECH fell to his knees. Tears ran down his dust-covered face. He was not a Hebrew. He was not a priest. He was not a prince. He was a foreigner, a servant, an unlikely one. And yet God saw him. God called him by name. God delivered him. While Zedekiah was captured, his sons killed before his eyes, and he himself blinded and taken in chains to Babylon, EBED-MELECH walked free, not by force, not by position, but by faith. Jerusalem fell, but the promise remained. Exile, silence, and hope. The silence that hung over Jerusalem after the destruction was more frightening than the cries of the invasion. It was a silence of mourning, of absence, of devastated land. The temple lay in ashes. The streets were deserted. The glory of Zion was now a distant echo. EBED-MELECH, freed by God's promise, saw the city empty. Many were taken into captivity. Others hid in caves. He, in turn, made a bold decision: to stay. There was no longer a palace to serve. There was no longer a king to obey. But there was hope. Jeremiah encouraged him. "The hand of God is still upon you. The eyes of the Most High have not left you. Restore what you can. Plant. Build. The Lord will protect you." Ebed went to live among the poor who had been left in the land, the useless in the eyes of the Babylonians, peasants, orphans, widows. For years, he had been the one who organized aid, shared bread, and taught the young to pray, even when it seemed that God had turned his face away. He was now 40 years old. His physical strength was no longer what it had been, but his spirit was stronger than ever. Amidst the rubble, he had become a pillar. One day, while he was working the land with his own hands, he heard rumors that a new governor had been appointed by the Babylonians. Gedaliah, a just man who valued peace and listened to the prophets. Gedaliah recognized EBED-MELECH and called him to his side. 1. You have survived the fall of kings because you served a greater king. Ebed became Gedaliah's counselor, not because of office or title, but because of the wisdom that suffering had given him. He knew how to listen. He knew how to be silent. He knew how to discern between a word of vanity and a word from God. However, the peace was brief. With the rise of Gedaliah came jealousy. A group of men, led by Ishmael, plotted an assassination. Despite the warnings, Gedaliah refused to believe that anyone among his people could betray him. EBED-MELECH, silent, felt the tension grow. Tragedy struck again. Gedaliah was assassinated. Ishmael tried to take control, but the people revolted. New chaos ensued. Many feared retaliation from the Babylonians, and in panic they decided to flee to Egypt, defying the voice of Jeremiah, who once again cried out, "Do not go down to Egypt. If you stay, God will protect you. But if you flee, You will die by the sword." EBED-MELECH was divided. He was no longer young. He was tired of wars, conspiracies, and losses. But he still heard that same voice that had once told him to save Jeremiah from the cistern. It was the same voice now saying, "Trust, stay." He stayed. Once again, most chose to flee. EBED-MELECH, now in his 50s, lived among the ruins, leading a small group of survivors. He no longer sought recognition, no longer expected reward. He knew he was exactly where God wanted him. At night, he sat under the stars, looking up at the sky as he had done as a child. But now he understood something that had been a mystery before. Faithfulness is not found in public victories, but in silent obedience. And the God of Israel sees the faithful, even when the world forgets. EBED-MELECH, the Ethiopian, the servant, the unlikely one, had become a legend among the humble. The story of how he had saved Jeremiah was told among the boys, and his courage was remembered by widows and elders. He had not ruled, he had not prophesied, he had not fought, but throughout his life, he had chosen to obey, and that made him eternal. The invisible legacy. Old age came to EBED-MELECH like a whisper, not a thunderclap. He now walked with the help of a hand-carved staff, a gift from a young man he had taken in as a boy. His beard, once short and neatly trimmed, had become thick and white as the wool of the lambs of Judah. His voice, though hoarse, was still steady when he spoke of God's promises. The small group of survivors in Judah treated him like a patriarch. There was no one like him, not because of titles or inheritance, but because of something much rarer: consistency between faith and practice. This was the same EBED-MELECH who had saved a prophet, who had cared for orphans, who had helped rebuild gardens amid the rubble, who had buried the dead with dignity when no one else would. He did not write scrolls. He did not give speeches. But everyone knew, when Ebed spoke, it was worth listening. Many came from far away just to meet him. Pilgrims, young Levites. Even some exiles returning from Babylon began to visit the region. Ebed welcomed them with warm bread, fresh water, and the same phrase: "Welcome to the land of promise. Even though it is in ruins, it continues to belong to God." One night, a young man named Azariah, about 20 years old, asked him, "Lord Ebed, what made you stay when everyone else fled?" Ebed looked up at the starry sky. He paused for a long time and answered, "God does not speak only to kings and prophets. He speaks to those who listen. And when he speaks, it is better to obey than to survive. The world saw me as a voiceless servant, but heaven knew my name. That was enough." The young man remained silent, absorbing each word as if listening to a revelation. In the last years of his life, EBED-MELECH began to plant date palms. He knew he would not see the fruit, but he planted them anyway. When asked why, he would smile. "I plant because I believe the people will return. And when they return, they will have shade and sweetness. God promised that he would restore Jerusalem, and I believe in him more than in what I see." It was this faith that sustained him until the end. One serene morning, at sunrise, they found Ebed sitting in the shade of an olive tree, with his hands crossed over his chest and his face at peace. He had left in silence, as he had lived, without applause, without crowds, but with a story that lived on in the hearts of those who were touched by his faithfulness. Jeremiah, already old and blind, heard the news and wept. He simply said, "A righteous man has departed, but his name will live on as long as there is faith in this land." And he did. The name that God does not forget. Years passed after the death of EBED-MELECH. Generations changed, kings rose and fell, empires took turns. Jerusalem was gradually rebuilt. The people returned from exile, bringing hope and also deep wounds. Many names were lost in time: nobles, soldiers, scribes, erased by the dust of history. But among the sacred records, preserved as a hidden gem, remained the name of a foreign servant, EBED-MELECH, servant of the king. His name, mentioned by the prophet Jeremiah, survived as a testimony of something rare, a faithful heart, even without an altar, without a pulpit, without a throne. The scribes wondered, why had God allowed this name among so many to remain in the scriptures? After all, he was not an Israelite, nor a priest, nor a prophet. But the answer was between the lines of his life. EBED-MELECH had been loyal when everyone else was betraying him, courageous when everyone else was hiding, obedient when faith seemed absurd. He did not need the spotlight, because his stage was heaven, and his audience was only God. Centuries later, during the Roman era, teachers of the law still read the scrolls of the prophet Jeremiah, and when they read the passage where God promised EBED-MELECH, "I will give your life as a plunder to you, because you trusted in me," Jeremiah 39:18, some rabbis were moved to silence. They said to their disciples, "Learn from this man. He was not born among us, but he lived as a righteous man of Israel." In first-century Judea, Jesus of Nazareth began to teach. And amidst the parables and sermons, a familiar message echoed, "Many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me." Without naming him directly, the spirit of EBED-MELECH's life was present in each of these truths. He was the example of the hidden servant who acts justly without expecting a reward, of the foreigner who honors the covenant more than the children of the house, of the improbable who becomes essential. His descendants, yes, there were those who carried his blood and his name, became silent guardians of memory. They would tell children on nights with a full moon, "One of us saved the prophet. One of us heard the voice of God. One of us planted hope in the midst of the ruins." In heaven, where records are not made with ink but with faith, EBED-MELECH's name was never forgotten, recorded in the book of life, remembered by angels, and honored by God. Today, in the 21st century, few speak of him. But those who find his story in the scriptures and allow themselves to listen beyond the words, discover that the true heroes of faith are not always those who appear on the altars, but those who, in the silence of obedience, touch the heart of God. EBED-MELECH did not live to be remembered, but for that very reason, he was never forgotten. Final reflections and eternal lessons. At the end of this story, it is impossible not to stop and reflect on the power of anonymity in God's work. EBED-MELECH, the foreign servant, became a living symbol of something that many forget. Heaven observes what men ignore. He did not perform spectacular miracles, found a line of kings, or write songs that echoed through the temple. But his quiet courage, his true compassion, and his unwavering faith were as powerful as any of Israel's great heroes. EBED-MELECH represents the invisible ones of the kingdom, those who clean the aisles of churches when everyone else has gone, the widows who pray in the early hours of the morning for children who do not know it, the forgotten missionaries in villages without internet, the single mothers who raise their children in faith, even without support, the men who resist corruption in silence, the young people who choose integrity when the world pressures them. This story is a living reminder that faithfulness is often more powerful than fame, that serving in the dark can shine brighter in heaven than preaching in the spotlight, and that, for God, the most important name is the one written with tears, sacrifice, and true love. As we study EBED-MELECH, we learn that one does not have to be one of the chosen people to be part of the divine mission. God looks at the heart, not the birthplace. Ebed was an Ethiopian, a foreigner, and yet he was an instrument of salvation. That good, no matter how small it may seem, is never forgotten.